Assalamu alaikum. So we are live with our next bootcamp session, another bootcamp session. Sir, please start with.
Okay, now the problem is not the problem. What we want to learn today is how to basically fetch data. Now we have to understand the problem. The problem is when you are fetching data, you want the UI to be unresponsive. In programming, the slowest part of the code is when you are basically what you are doing is basically getting network calls are very slow compared to computation.
Yes.
So therefore, what happens is if you are getting data from the network and the UI hangs or is very slow, not responsive, people will think your application has crashed. So what you'd want to do is get that data in the background. Am I right, Zeeshan?
Yes.
And
Basically,
yes, go ahead.
basically the problem is you need to understand the timeline of your application and the processes it is working in background. So whenever you try to reach access data from the network or any data which is not in your normal timeline of JS call, what will do is your application or your UI need to hang or stay intact until you receive the data. So you need to separate the timeline so that your UI stays responsive, and you fetch the data from the server or you do something in the background, and then your UI keeps working just like Facebook. Whenever we click on some button or we share a button, it send let's say we share a post, so it sends a request in the background, but you can keep scrolling the Facebook, you can keep chatting, the request goes in the background. That's what we need to achieve.
Therefore, before we move into how to use it in React, first we'll try to understand the fetch API, which is built into the browser, into the
Mhm.
JavaScript library. There are a number of other libraries, but first we have to understand the default library provided by JavaScript.
Yes.
Ishan, let's get started.
Let me share my screen. Okay. So what we can do is, should we directly go to the
Yes, yes, go ahead.
example?
Just go ahead.
Okay. So let me just. What I'll do is I'll not creating a React application. I'll just create simple HTML JS and we'll try to see how fetch works. Okay, so we need to understand that we need to send a network call. So for the network call, it started with in somewhere around 1995 or late 90s. Microsoft introduced an object called HTML HTTP request, and that was a very complicated object, or it requires a bit of effort. So what during the over the period of time, different libraries provided you the functionality to send a request with an easy syntax. Now it is built in within the JavaScript, so you just don't need to do anything. You just, what you can do is just call the fetch and provide the URL. I'll provide the URL here later. And again, we in last class we have discussed this, that you can use as it as a promise, and you can use it with async await. So I'm directly going to with the syntax of async await, so that you keep constant. Now we need to send a network call. Right at this moment, we do not have any server to call the API. So what we'll do is we'll use the dummy API, which you can find on the internet if you search. But I'll just use this JSON placeholder type code. So what you can do is you can just type in the browser dummy JSON API, and you can get this first link. There are multiple others, but you can get this one. So just call the first JSON placeholder dot type code. This site provides you a dummy JSON API, which you can call, and it will return you the data, which you can use as your server. So what we'll do is we'll use this API, JSON placeholder API, to do copy this, and I'll pass this here, semicolon.
If you go back to the API where you copied the API from,
Yes.
I just noticed something. There are two thens. There are two thens on whatever is returning. By that
Yeah.
definition, it means that the fetch is returning a promise, and then the second then is also returning a promise. That's why they are able to call then on it.
Yes, basically, as we have discussed again in the last class, that if we need to make a chain of a promises, so your first then will return another promise. So in this case, whenever you the fetch API, what fetch API do is whenever you send a request to the server, it returns with a promise. You receive a response, and that response is also a promise. With that promise, you can access a JSON format data, text format data, blob format. Let's say you have an image, blob format data, or any other format. There are 4 or 5 type of formats which you can get the data. So it depends what kind of data server is returning. In our case, at this moment, server is returning JSON data. That's why we are calling the JSON response. If it were if this API was for the image, so we will be accessing blob. So at this moment, it's just returning the data response, and then from that response, we'll call .json. So it will again another promise which will convert your data into the JSON format, and then you can access it.
Marvelous, marvelous.
Okay.
Let's try.
So in response, let me show you first the what it will do. What response will return to us. If you can see, it returns a promise here.
And we had covered promise in the last class.
Yes, we have covered in detail.
I think you made a spelling mistake.
Okay, so response, and it returns the promise. So now you need to again call information on that promise so that you can get data whatever you want. At this moment, we want data in JSON format because we know it's in the API returns JSON.
Spelling mistake.
Okay. I just initially wrote the wrong spell. Okay. So now JSON is okay. One more thing. Now, what I did is I forget to write the keyword await.
But in order to do that, you have to write in an async function.
And let me show them that we will receive the another error. Await is only valid in async, so I'll have to
And you also have to call this function.
yes. Now, so in first case, it returns the response, which has multiple information, and then we converted it into the JSON, and now we have three properties completed: false, ID1, title, and user ID. So this is how we call the fetch API. There are multiple at this moment. This is a get API. What we can do is we can call the post API, and we can send data to the server as well. Should I show the post API as well?
Of course, of course. So there are two ways to call a get. What is the difference between get and post?
Okay. Whenever we are, there are four type of call when you sending an API request: get, post, put, and I just forgot the fourth. Del. And for the delete we use.
There are four kinds of what do you call REST API calls.
Yes. So for the get, what we do, whenever we are fetching the data, whenever we are pulling the data from the server, we just need data from the server. So we use get request. In terms of the problem with the get is whole data, whatever you request you are sending to the server, it will be available as a plain text, and you can see in the browser URL. It does not hide any data. In case of post, whenever you send the data, the data you are sending with the request hides in the body, and it does not expose in the browser URL, so it is hidden. Right? So whenever you are sending posting data, you need to submit the data, you use the post API. When you need to fetch the data, you use get API. And the difference is when you call the get API, all data will be in plain text. In post, the data you are sending with the your API will be hidden in the body.
Could you please change the name of the fetch data to get data in the first method?
Okay.
So that everybody remembers it.
Get data, and we'll call it
Post data.
And this is a post data. For the post, I'll just refer again to the API provided by this service so that we can access the. Let me check its system. Create a resource. Okay, this is the API. Again, this is a dummy API. What it do is you send the request on this API on this resource, and you send an object with it. This object requires a method key. So you want to send a post request or get request. So even if you are sending a get request, you can use this object, and instead of writing post, you can write the get. At this moment, we need to send a post request, so method colon post. Then what we need to do is we need to send the data with the API with the request. So we'll do the body, and we need to send a JSON object. So we use this JSON object and we convert it into the string. So it will stringify, it will be a simple string. when it's traveling to the network, and then we are sending the header, so that we are setting that we are sending the JSON request. Once we send that request, we will definitely receive a response from the server. Again, that response is a promise, and we can access data from that promise. So what I'll do is I'll copy this post object, URL, mention over here. Now here I want to provide few properties. First one is method, which we mentioned post. Second one is body. In body, we need to send object, but this object should be converted to string file. So let me first send the add the values for the object, and then I'll apply the string file. Pass anything. This is a JSON object. It will not work as it is, so we need to convert in it JSON.stringify. Call a function JSON.stringify and convert in this way. Okay. Then we need to provide the header as a third parameter, as a third property. That header requires content type. Content type says what type of content we are sending to the server. So at this moment we are saying we are sending the JSON data, and then we'll handle the response. So again we are using this await syntax. So we'll have this response. We make access the JSON again, and then we'll see. Okay, so after the get, I'll probably
Post data.
post it. Let me comment out the get one so that we can. Okay. So here it is. It's just returning the information. So it returns the ID 101. All other data is same. The body, I send the data. I mentioned the my info. I mentioned the user ID, but the ID of object is coming from the server. So when I send the request to the server, it is like we are creating a user or information on the server. Server is storing in a database and returning information to you. So we do this with post request. So here is the syntax again. We call the fetch API, and second argument. In second argument, we need to provide an JSON object. This JSON object mention the method, whether it is a post or get or put, and we need to provide the body or whatever data we need to send, and that's data need to be in object, and we convert this into stringify so that it will be a simple string, and then header, what type of content type we are sending to the server. This is how we call the get and post APIs. Then with the normal fetch and get API.
Okay, we have learned basically the basics of this thing. Zeeshan, the problem is whenever I'm using fetch or getting data from the server, most of the time if there's something going wrong, I can't figure out if there is a problem with the API or there's some problem with my code. So there is a service called Postman. What does it do?
Okay, Postman is a extension. Initially, it was an extension to the browser. Now it's in a separate application. You can use it. What it does is you can verify your API, its data, by using that service. Let me show it. Apps. Generally, Postman is a browser extension, but you can use it Postman as a separate. Let me find out Postman. Go to the. It's a very powerful tool to review your API, to understand, and you can list all your APIs and you can test them individually. Here you can find the Postman. I'm just starting it so that I can show you the UI.
It has become very popular. It is getting
Yeah,
also a lot of investment.
yeah. Postman has is a great advantage of just whenever you want to, instead of like we have to, what we have to do is we have to create a simple application, and then we need to call them with whatever we need to do. We have to provide all the code to fetch response, everything. Instead of this, we can just we can just set up the API in the Postman and it will do the work. Let me show you. So I, at this moment, because I have been using this, so there are many tabs over here, so you don't need to worry about. You just need to click on the plus button. It will show you the interface. You can provide your URL here. You can mention which uh, type of method you want to call. So let's say we're going to pick again our get request of to do while copying the API get method, and instead of doing anything else, let me just click the send. It returns the data directly. I cannot zoom it in, but you can see this is the data. If I just provide the API and click the send button, it returns the data in a JSON format. So instead of going through the whole code implementation, I can just verify my API over here, test the implementation, if it's working fine or not, and then I can move forward with it.
And can you also test the post APIs?
Yes, I can also do this. Okay, so for post, what I need to do is copy post.
This way you will figure out if there is something wrong with the
Yeah,
API or there's something wrong with your code.
yes. Okay. So what I can do is I can send the raw data or I can send the JSON data. That is string. Let me go this way. We'll provide value individually. Key and value. So in header, there is already mentioned. So let me change it with okay. So here I mentioned the URL in the top. I changed the request to the post. In the body section, what I did is I select the option of you can do with the form data, but then you need to your server need to handle it in that way. So I select the URL encoded, and I provided the key value pair, whatever value we need to send in a JSON format. So key, my info, body, data, user ID, and then header. As we are sending the JSON request, so we need to provide content type with the JSON, and then I click the send button. So it returns the response. It submits the data and returns the value, and we can see that Here we have 101. I can send it again. I'll keep receiving this information.
Wonderful. Now the students can play for themselves
Yes.
with different APIs. So
So the basic.
what was the
Yes.
dummy URL which you were getting the data from? You can also share it again.
Yes. It is called jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. You can go to this URL, or you can search directly dummy JSON API. You can have multiple options for that.
Okay. Okay. Marvelous. Marvelous. So what we have learned so far is that basically you can, there are a number of ways to get data from the server. What we want to do is you can either make a GET request. In the browser, when you type on the URL box, basically you are making a GET request. But when you want to send the data, as well as in the body, as well as get data in the body, you will call a POST request. For now, it is enough. And what you have to remember is that in order to test the API, that if API is working, you can go and basically test, use Postman and use that. Now we are going to, and of course, all this fetch data returns a promise, and therefore, in order to basically, as we explained in the previous class, basically you was going to say await, and it will basically block the data moving forward, but everything will be working in the background. UI will be also working in the background. Now,
Yes.
what we are going to do is use. Can you? How are you going to now move to the next section where we are going to use React, and it is also share this code with all the students?
At this moment, or
Uh,
we can do it at the end of the class.
we can do it at the end of the class.
Okay, so we'll send, give access to this code at the end of the class. I'll submit
Okay.
to the GitHub. At this
Uh-huh.
moment, because we need to use UseEffect, and UseEffect is a feature of React, so we need to create a React application, which I already did a few moments ago. I just started the React. Where it is, demo fetch. Okay, so we have the basic React structure with us. What we can do is, start. Let's start the application. Okay, so while the application is being loaded, what we can do is to fetch the data from the server in React application. We have multiple options. If we are using the class component, we have a lifecycle method component, did mount component, will mount, in which you can call the fetch API. In case of in our case, here we need to show, we need to call this API, so we have a function called UseEffect. What it will do is, it will Let me show you the example first. Here is the UseEffect function. For all the lifecycle method, let's say component did mount, component will mount, they are the class functions. So the, the basic objective of hooks is to make the functional component a stateful component to help functional component use whatever we were using with the class component. So in the class component, we were calling the fetch API because before that functional component were the stateless component and they were static component. We can not do such things in functional component. With the help of hooks, we can do so. So in case of UseEffect replaces component did mount, component will mount, and whatever the lifecycle functions we have. So you can call the use effect, and what it will do is whenever the component renders, it will call this use effect function and whatever code it is in it. If it updates the data, so your component will re-render. We'll see in a moment. So this is the syntax of use effect. Use effect is a function. It accepts a arrow function, and in that arrow function you put your uh, call for the API. So what I'll do is, here we can just let me go to the application. Fetch, and now in app.js, what I'll do is I'll call use effect. You need to import this. I just use the ID, so I just I press the enter button and it just imported. So if you are just copy pasting from somewhere, so you just need to understand that you need to import use effect as well. Here what I'll do is I'll call the arrow function, and there is a second argument. We'll discuss on this later. At this moment we don't need to call it, so let me call the fetch API over here. So what we can do is we can easily go for our own code and we can directly copy this data over here, but there we need to change something. So let me first copy everything here. We have this, and let's just run it so that we can see what we do. It's just giving so much error, parsing error. Await outside the async function. It's an async function, so we need to call it async.
Spelling.
Yeah. So here we can see it's giving us the data. Let me refresh it once more so that you can see the result. It is giving us some warning, but I'll ignore it for now. So here we have completed ID, title, and user ID. We have the 4 properties. Whenever, as soon as the app component being loaded, it will call the use effect. So use effect is just like a component did mount or component will mount. It will do the same work, but in functional component. So it did its work, but we don't want to use just to call and show the response. What we need to do is we need to display that response into our component, and what we need to do is until we do not have the data, we should display like data is being loading, or once we have the data, we display the data. Why we need to do this? Let me show you. Let's say we need to display what properties we have. Title. Let me pick the title only. And now I need to display title. So how can I display the title? One option, I keep the data variable over here. Initially, what I need to set, I don't know. Let's say null. Put title. Okay, so it's giving me an error because why? Because as soon as the component is loaded, it tries to display data.title, but initially data is null. You once it send the request to the server, once you receive the response, then data will have this information, but it will not wait, because as we have discussed, the start of our discussion was that our UI should not wait till the data coming from the server. So this is what happening, but in this case our application is being crashed because we do not have data until now. So what we need to do is, first I'll go with the use state information so that we can use
Just,
the
in place of null, why don't you write waiting for response from server?
what should I write?
Waiting for response from server. Waiting response from server.
Okay.
Let's see, string. Let's make it a string. Yeah.
String won't work because we are using data.title.
Yes. Okay. In the title, put that thing.
Okay, just a moment. It's a constant, so I need to change it to the. But we cannot change the constant again. Waiting for the data. We receive the data, yet UI is not updated. Why is that so?
It should have updated the UI.
Yeah, but as we have discussed in our first or second class of React, that once data is being displayed, anything is being displayed, you need to, if you need to update the data, that's the beauty of React, that you just update the variable and it display it re-renders the component. To do so, you need to use use state, use reducer, or anything else, but this is the direct data. React does not know that data property, data object is updated now, and React need to re-render that component. Otherwise, you need to do it manually. So to for React to understand that data is being received and React need to update the component, we need to inform React that this object is updated. That's why we cannot do it in this way, and we need to move towards the use state property, use state function,
Go ahead.
which we did the last time. Uh, so it is what it is. It is
Say use state in use state. Basically, you import the use state function.
yes. And initially it will be an object.
I think there is a spelling mistake in the constant.
Okay, now it's in to do, and what I need to do is set to do. Here what we need to do is, once we receive this JSON data, we need to update the
Why don't you pass the data to the use state thing?
This data?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can do that. And then what we can do is set to do whatever we'll receive from this JSON, we'll set in this to do. And now what we'll do is we'll call this to do variable dot title.
Let's see if it works.
Hopefully. Another error. Type destroy is not a function. Error occurred JSON.9 UseEffect. Beauty of live coding.
Why don't you? Go ahead. I think you made it equal to data. You should have use state. The first is the variable, and the second one is the data. Therefore,
There's a use state. I just
and the thing is, when you are saying data, here you say to do. Maybe.
let me change the variable name just for the
There is error.
just an effect function must not returning anything besides function. Okay, so another mistake. I'm calling as an async function, so it provides the normal function. So what I'll do is I'll create async function here.
What are you returning? I don't. Actually, you are returning.
And initially, what I did is I just made the async function, which is the which UseEffect requires. So UseEffect is not accepting the async function. So what we need to do is we need to do it ourselves. So I can do the directly function, but let's. Okay, now we have the updated value.
Please, could you revise it? What you did correctly now?
Yes, just a moment. So initially waiting for data and then it gets updated. You can see initially okay. So what we did is everything else is same as we learned for the React application. There's no change, but what we need to do is we need to call the API so that we can have a data from the server. So we need to call the fetch, which we learned in previous example. So we need to don't need to revise it. What we need to learn is that we need to call a UseEffect function. So whatever server calls or whatever we need to do on the loading of component or after loading a component, so we need to call the UseEffect function, and we need to provide a arrow function inside that function. Now here, this is the body of a function. Here we need to call our fetch. And what we did is initially we were trying to directly update the data variable, and it was not being updated because React needs to know that if some data is being updated, so React can re-render its component. So we cannot do with the normal properties. So what we need to do, what we did is initially we call use state, and we provide the data, which is just initial data. And then what we did is we call the to do as a property, so that whatever data will be receiving, it will be available in to do property. And to update the data, to set the data, we'll call the set to do function. So our fetch function inside of use effect, because we are using async await, so we need async function. So what I did is I create the function async function fetch data, and then the fetch API call, we are printing the response. We are converting the response into the JSON, and then this data, what we need to do is we need to update whatever data we receive into the set to do function. Why? Because if we do this way, then React will know that React need to re-render this component. So we provide that value in set to do, and once set to do is done, in the fetch data, we call this fetch data. So once the app components being loaded, once it is loaded, it send the request to the server. Meanwhile, it will display waiting for data, and then what it will do is once we receive the data from the server, the UseEffect function will be called again, and it will re-render the component so that you will get the new data.
I'd like to add some things here.
Yes.
Let's go back to the code.
Yes.
The first thing to remember is that UseEffect is called after, I'm repeating, after that component is being rendered. So therefore, you can see that UseEffect is called first waiting for data is printed, then after the component is done printing everything on the screen, then UseEffect is called.
Yes.
And when UseEffect is called, it basically works in the background, it gets data from somewhere, and then it shows it on the screen. But in order to force React to re-render, then in re-render. But the problem is, every time you re-render, after that UseEffect will be called.
Yes.
In this application, the problem is it may be called twice. Now, how to solve that? If you go to the original article on screen, remember they are saying an array is being passed after that.
Yes.
This thing is basically telling if the state, if for example we write 6 and again we write 6. Let's go back and see. If we pass array,
array,
yes, and in that array you just pass 6, fixed 6.
Okay.
Now let's see what happens. It is only being called once because the state has not changed. The state has, because you are saying it was previously 6 and again it is 6.
I just my developer tool is not being shown. Just let me just.
There's some notification in the bottom.
This is for the screen share.
Yeah. So I just gave you a hint. I just gave you a hint that whenever you are passing, you are calling UseEffect, just make sure that um, whenever the state changes, only then it is called.
What we can do is we can control the use effect, so you can apply the changes only being the use effect being called only for the changes we want. So let's say we have another property, maybe just a random some thought. So we can, what we can do is data. So whenever there is a change in is data property, okay, I need to do is provide the array. Whenever the is data being updated, there is a change in is data property, use effect will be called.
Mm-hmm. That's a marvelous way of. Zeeshan, you are a genius. That's why. That's why. Uh, that's why you are rich, and that's why I call you my brother. Okay. Now we have basically learned two things. All this thing will be revised by Adil in the next class.
Okay.
But before, when we are beginning the class, this fetch data and use effect, today Adil was not well, so therefore we basically he will do his work next time. Now,
Yes.
what are the different ways? You mentioned two of them. One
Yes.
was when you were using hierarchy, sorry, components class, which
Yes.
component did mount and all the rest of the stuff.
Yes.
But we are not going to go into that because we are declaring React as functions only and using the latest technology. But there is another latest technology that is going to come up. What is that, Adil? Zeeshan?
That's very interesting element, because whenever we are trying to display a component, first what we need to do is let me first add something here so that we can explain that property, that new feature. At this moment, what we are trying to do is we are displaying this component, but sometimes that component has lot of properties and lot of UI, which is too much dependent on the response of your server. So what we can do is we can skip the rendering of that particular component and we can display directly something, let's say loading or something else. So instead, because at this moment this was very simple component and we just display the dummy data. So what we can do is we can uh, create a property, and once we start the once we start the fetching data, we can set this property set fetching to true, so that it's know that we have started the fetching, and once we done the set to do, what we'll do is we call the set fetching to false. It will do nothing as of now, so we will not have any difference. Now what we can do is we can, if is fetching true, so return So it's a split of seconds. So what I'll do is I'll slow my uh, network call so that we can see the response. Initially, it's showing data loading, and then once we receive the data, it displays the
How,
component.
how did you slow down the network call?
In our developer tool, we have the network tab. On network tab, what we can do is we can normally it's an online that means it goes to the as a normal call. But if we need to test our API, that if it's working fine or if our application will work as it is on a slow network as well. So what we can do is we can click the slow 3G, or we can make it offline. So once I click it offline, that means there is no internet connection. It will give, I have the internet, but I marked it offline. So we can test our offline application in this way. So I just click this slow 3G and I press this. It shows data loading, and then it's
Marvelous. This is just for debugging so that you can test it on
yes,
different kinds of networks.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is as soon as component starts loading,
Mm-hmm.
it will tries to render this component, and use effect being called, it set the is fetching to true. So as soon as this fetching set to true, the components will get re-rendered, and components will this is fetching is if because the is fetching is true, so it will return this div component instead of returning. So as we know, it's in a function. So if we are returning from here, so it will not go to this line. So it will return this. Once we receive the data from the server, we'll returning back our fetch to false. So if fetching is false, a component will re-render again. It check this out. It will be false. So this if will not work, and we'll receive this component. So this is we normally do in our component, but at this moment we have a single component and a very simple API. So it seems okay. But in a complex application, what happen is in a single page we have a multiple API request, and there can be multiple components. Let's say you have Facebook. So at the right side you have a list of friends, you have a stream, you have activities, and in the center you have all of your timeline. At the right side you have the group list of groups. So all these components are separate component, and when you refresh that, Facebook send multiple API requests to fetch all this component information for these components separately, and then these components gets updated. So you have a multiple components, and you need to make the timeline correct, and you need to maintain if data is being loaded or not. So you need to maintain. So this is fetching property is for one component. So what I need to do is I need to do this for friend list also. So there will be another property fetching friends, fetching streams, fetching timeline, fetching groups, and there are hundred of things can be in a component. So we need to maintain a lot of properties first. Second is what we need is if the two components are separate, but the data timeline is dependent on each other. So we need to make, once the first component is being loaded, then we need to load that other one. In that case, what will happen is the fetch should be done, but it should display once the first API. We'll discuss. I think I'm just getting creating complexity over here.
Uh-huh.
So what we have is for this we have a solution which is in still experimental stage. We have a solution which is called a suspense component. So what suspense component is, I was trying to explain it, and I just add a lot of complexity. So I just will move back to what we have here. Okay. So We have discussed the class component as we have already discussed in component in mount. We did the use effect. We discussed the use effect. There is another one which is called suspense. What it does is, instead of maintaining those properties separately, is fetching. You need to maintain separately, and then if there is an error, you need to display an error. If there is an data is still being loading, so you need to handle it this way, which I did over here. So instead of maintaining this written separately and this component written separately, what we can do is we can add our component inside a suspense component, and we provide the fallback. What fallback do is, until data is being loading, it's being loaded, it will display whatever we have in fallback. Once data loading is complete or fetch is complete, it will display our component. But life is not that easy. We need to add multiple things for that. Okay, so what we need to do is, for this fetch style of fetch work, we need to add a code. Another thing, uh, as this suspense option is an experimental stage, so what you need to do is you need to install the React experimental and React DOM experimental, so that this feature you can use this feature. Unless you don't use this experimental React, you will not be able to call the suspense component, and you will not able to use this component.
But in the near future, this requirement will be removed.
Yeah, it will be removed. So in our case, what I'll do is,
Create another component or
yes. What we are trying to do. Postman.js and so there's a simple component, and in app.js, what we'll do is uh, if we'll keep this code, it will affect our functionality of suspense.
maybe we create another application.
Okay, let's create another application. Meanwhile, it's being loaded. Let me show what we need to do. First, we need to install the experimental React component, the experimental React library, so that we'll be in experimental mode. What we'll do is we'll create a fetch for a component. We'll create a separate function, and there is another function which we need to implement is create resource. This function, you need to understand first what this function is doing. Initially, first you need to understand, whenever you call create resource, it will return an object. That object contain a function. So create resource will return an object. That object has a function called read. You can name it anything, but at this moment you have read. And then this read function is checking what is the status. If the status is still loading, then it will throw a suspender like an error, so that suspense component knows that there is still data is still being loaded, and it will not show the component. Else, if it's an error, so it will throw the error. If status is success, it will return the result. That's what the return of this function do. But the part which is really working this out, status equals to loading, let result, and here is our function fetch post. This is a fetch post function, and what it does is whenever we call it, it returns the data. So we'll call the fetch post, and we'll apply dot then over here. So it will apply just like the promise. So it will apply the then data. Once if it's success, what it will do is it will call the data first function, and it update the property to success, and it will provide the data to result property. If there is an error, so again you need to understand that this fetch post is an async function. What async function do is it work as a promise. So whenever you call the fetch post, you can apply dot then over it, and dot then accepts the in this case that we can provide two function in the then. First one is for success, second one is for error. So this is for success and this is for error. So let's say if we our API call is successful, so this status will be updated to success. So we can see that if it's success, it will return this. If we see that if it's an error, in case of error, it will show this result. And if it's still being loaded, so it will throw the suspender so that it knows that the component should not be displayed until there is some result. So this is the function, and we'll see later, maybe today or in the next class, that we will not be writing this in future, but for as of now, we need to write this function.
The thing is, Zeeshan, what we are going to do is we gave a flavor of the updating API which are coming up in the future.
Yes.
We are not going to implement it because the API might change, and this
Yes.
video is being watched for the next maybe years. So therefore, we just gave a flavor. When it is finalized, we will take another video and upload it so that everybody understands. But for now, we just gave a flavor. We don't have to show it.
Okay.
And so that because APIs will change most probably, because this thing is a little bit complicated at this stage. So I have a feeling that APIs might change a bit. Huh?
Yeah. So here is the so the student can see. We call the create resource. It has the resource, and we call the suspense. And inside the post list, we pass the resource, and it will just what it will do is it will resource.read. So you have the data, and it will load. So until data is being loaded, this post list component will not be displayed. So the important thing is that in case of UseEffect, in case of the class component, what was happening is component was loaded. Once component is done with the loading, then the fetch API is being called, UseEffect is being called. That means it's afterwards. What we need to do is we don't need to display the component, and don't need to start the rendering of component until we have the data. So in that case, we can use this suspense, and this will work this way.
Okay. Whatever we code we have written, please post it on Git so that the students are able to see check the code, and made it in a single repository so that they don't have to go to two repositories.
Okay.
Zeeshan, from next class, in order to save time, what we'll do is create a repository before starting the class. So that
Sure. I'll do the next class. Okay.
I didn't ask you to do it because I wanted everybody to become comfortable with creating repositories and posting data to it. But now, once they have known it, we just make a commit in the future.
Yes. So we have all these, both of these uh, code over here, the demo fetch and local fetch, so that we can use what
Can
we say.
you share the URL a little bit in a bigger font?
Demo React use effect.
Perfect, perfect. The code is pushed.
Yes.
Okay, bye-bye everyone. Thank you so much, Zeeshan, for teaching all of us and helping all of us out. May God give you a very intelligent, beautiful, wealthy, uh, who thinks you are a genius wife, who obeys all your commands. She she feeds you perfect food.
Actually,
Uh,
we need a GitHub action.
she knows how to cook Chinese food. She knows how to cook Pakistani food, Italian food, French food, so that you can become fat and rich. Thank you so much, my buddy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.